On a hot summer evening in 1992, neighbors heard the familiar sound of an argument coming from the Campano residence. According to Christopher Campano, his wife left the house shortly after their argument to calm down. Karen Campano was never seen again. Karen Campano was just 2 weeks shy of her 43rd birthday when she disappeared. She had just come back to Oklahoma City after visiting her 3 children who were living in New York. Back to the home she shared with her 3rd husband, Chris.
She come back from New York and she went to talking about moving back because of her family, and she's upset.
Chris and Karen Campano were married in December of 1987. Friends described them as an odd couple. She was 15 years older than Chris, and it was her 3rd marriage, his first. They were introduced to one another by Karen's best friend, who also happened to be Chris's mother. Chris was a drifter, worked construction jobs, and spent some time in jail for petty theft. Karen was the main wage earner, working as a bill collector for this credit adjustment company in town. On the evening of July 1st, 1992, Chris and Karen had one of their frequent arguments, this time over his use of drugs.
And I was into drugs, and she was, nagging at me and trying to get me in drug programs and, just trying to help.
It was loud enough for the neighbors to hear.
I could hear Karen screaming, and no, please, please, and don't do that. And couldn't make out a lot of what was being said, just a lot of screaming.
According to Chris, after the argument, Karen left the house for a walk, headed to the Buy for Less convenience store for some personal items a few blocks away. Chris left too, driving to a local bar for a few drinks, staying until about midnight. The next morning, Chris called Karen's office to see if she had reported to work. Her supervisor said she hadn't shown up or even called in. Chris then phoned the police to report her missing. When the police arrived to take Chris's statement, they looked around briefly and reported seeing no evidence of foul play or anything out of place or unusual.
If a person is going to run away or leave her husband, she's not just going to walk away and leave everything behind. She's going to take the things that mean the most to her, especially when you're dealing with a woman, things of, toiletries, makeup, and that kind of thing. And of course, we found all those things intact in the bedroom and in the bathroom, and it was as if she just disappeared off the face of the earth without taking anything with her.
While the police were there, Chris mentioned that the house had been burglarized the night before while he was out drinking and that some items were missing. Police asked Chris to sign a waiver to allow a search of the house.
And he agreed to do so and thought that would be good, and even commented that he hoped that we found something in the house that would help us with the investigation.
The first thing I recall seeing is the bed was against the south wall, and right next to the bed was a large white trash bag. And underneath that trash bag, I could see a very large brownish colored stain. Of course, the next thing we did was went and got some Hemosticks, which we carried in our vehicle.
A Hemostick is a chemical strip that can immediately tell whether or not blood is present.
Take the dry Hemostick and with your finger just lightly smear it on the suspect stain to where some of it's transferred onto the Hemostick. Take a drop of distilled water, put it on the Hemostick, flick off the excess water, and you have a dark green, which is a positive presumptive test for the presence of blood.
The stain on the carpet was indeed blood, but was it human? And if so, whose was it?
The first day we were in the house, I put on a pair of gloves, and that spot on that carpet was still moist. This piece of carpet and the padding was completely soaked with blood. It was such a massive amount of blood that there was still actual moisture involved there. It was not completely dried.
The carpet was removed and delivered to the Oklahoma City Police Department's forensic chemistry lab.
I went on to do a
Ochterlony test is a species determination test to determine as to whether or not that blood came from a human or an animal source.
It was human blood.
That was enough to convince me that we weren't dealing with a routine missing persons case.
The police needed more to go on and felt the answers lay inside the Campanos' house. When police discovered human blood inside the Campanos' bedroom, they suspected the blood stain might belong to Karen Campano. They also suspected that Chris knew more about her disappearance than he was admitting.
She left at 7:30. What did you do then?
Under police questioning, Chris maintained that he knew nothing about his wife's whereabouts, but his alibi was weak. The bartender didn't recall seeing Chris Campano on the night of July 1st, and police discovered that Chris had pawned some of Karen's jewelry the morning after her disappearance. Without a body, the only thing left for the police to do was run more tests inside the house. There weren't any visible signs of violence besides the bloodstain they found in the bedroom.
We saw a typical little frame house for central Oklahoma City that, as you went inside, looked quite clean, quite neat. Things had been cleaned out of it. The walls looked clean, ceiling looked clean, the floor looked clean. So there wasn't much to see at all.
So they decided to look for blood which may have been cleaned up or wasn't visible to the naked eye. To do so, investigators used a special chemical solution called luminol, an extremely sensitive test which can detect blood which has been removed by water or even detergents and bleach.
Luminol is a fluorescence-type chemical. Spray it on a substance that may contain blood. It reacts with the heme group in the blood itself. The iron portions will luminesce or fluoresce.
To do the luminol test, investigators needed complete darkness, so they waited until nightfall. They began their chemical dragnet in the bedroom, where they discovered the stain on the carpet a few days earlier. First, they took photographs of the room, the way it looked to the naked eye. Then they sprayed the luminol. The results were astonishing.
There were some instances in that house where it glowed so brightly that you could actually see the person standing next to you. There was so much blood in there.
The luminol told a horrific tale. Blood had been everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, on the doors.
It looked like a bloodbath had occurred there, something from a horror movie.
Even more telling was the blood spatter, which is the placement of the stains. Where they were located, the size of the drops and the trails of blood all told a story. Someone had been beaten in the bedroom with a blunt object.
They were in two trails, what we refer to as cast-off trails. So if you had an object, for example, in your hand, and that object was blood-covered, and if you were swinging that object overhead, the centrifugal force of pulling the blood down to the end of the object will cast the blood in the direction the object is being swung. And in this case, it's going to the ceiling. There are two distinct trails, and you can tell that there's at least two swings with the blood-covered object.
Luminol was then applied to the rest of the house and even to the outside steps and walkways.
At one point, there's a swipe of blood that was on the kitchen door leading into the utility room that would have been about head level if you were carrying a body and had to turn the body sideways to get it through a normal door. And then at that point, it appeared the body was laid down on the ground and then drug from the utility room down the back steps.
And you could see pooled luminescence on each step, and then drag marks that were luminescent all the way down the walkway until you got to the point that you were at the driveway, and at that point they disappeared. Very, very dramatic presentation.
The house was telling its story, one of an apparently gruesome attack. But there were still unanswered questions. Where was the body? And the weapon? And was the blood Karen Campano's? Police still couldn't prove a murder had been committed. Although the police knew someone was violently attacked inside the Campano residence, they couldn't be sure a homicide had been committed. Was there enough blood in the Campano house to prove that someone was dead? And was that someone Karen Campano?
The investigators at a later time decided that we'd go back and try to do a measurement test to see how much blood had to have been let out on that carpet to make that size of a stain.
Police made sure their test was as accurate as possible. They used a piece of the original carpet as well as a weight to simulate a human head. Next, they poured human blood around the weight until they created a stain measuring 887 square inches, the same size stain they originally discovered.
Statistically, one could say that between 1,300 and 1,400 cc's of blood would create that stain.
That's more than 40% of the blood volume of a woman Karen Campano's size. No one could survive with that amount of blood loss.
So at that point, it became pretty apparent to me that if this lady was missing and if this lady was dead, that this lady probably was killed right there.
The authorities now knew a homicide had been committed in the house and that someone had died in the bedroom in a pool of blood. But was the victim Karen Campano? Police didn't have a sample of Karen Campano's blood to compare to the blood stain. If Karen's mother and father were still living, it would have been a simple matter to examine their DNA, since Karen would have received half of her DNA from her mother and half from her father, but Karen's father was deceased. The Oklahoma City Police Department asked the FBI to get involved to see if there was any way they could figure out whether the blood found in the house belonged to Karen Campano. The police obtained blood samples from Karen's mother, her 2 sisters, her 3 children, and one of her ex-husbands.
And so in this particular case, the object of the examination was to see if this DNA from the bloodstain of unknown origin was matching, at least half of the DNA was matching to the relatives from Karen Campano.
Hal Dedman of the FBI's DNA analysis unit conducted what is called RFLP analysis, analyzing pieces of DNA from 4 different chromosomes. This is the DNA profile of Karen Campano's mother. And next to it, on either side, are 2 of her daughters, Karen Campano's sisters. Both daughters share half of their DNA with their mother. This lane shows a DNA sample from one of Karen Campano's ex-husbands. The next lane shows a sample from his son, whose mother was Karen Campano. The father and son both share the upper band. The son would have received the lower band from his mother, which matches the band from his grandmother, Karen's mother. The next autorad compares the family member's DNA to the unknown blood stain found in the Campano home. The top marker matches the genetic profile from the first of Karen Campano's children, and the markers from the blood stain also matched the bands from Karen Campano's 2 other children from another marriage.
Results were fairly straightforward. They were totally consistent with the blood coming from Karen Campano.
8 months after the disappearance of Karen Campano, police concluded that Christopher Campano murdered his wife and was arrested. All of the evidence pointed towards Chris Campano. The forensic evidence, the argument neighbors heard on the night of Karen's disappearance, Chris's lack of an alibi for the entire evening, and the fact that he pawned some of her things. The prosecution believed that Karen Campano never left her house for a walk, as her husband had suggested. Neighbors heard Karen and Chris arguing that night, and the forensic evidence suggests that the argument moved to their bedroom, where it escalated and turned violent. As Chris stood near the window, he struck Karen in the head with a blunt object, at least 3 times, possibly more, producing the cast-off blood trails on the ceiling and walls. Karen fell to the floor, her head striking the bedpost where her blood was also found. As Karen lay bleeding from her massive head injuries, Chris left and went to a local bar. He needed to wait until the neighbors were asleep before removing Karen's body. When he returned home, he wrapped Karen's body in a sheet with a telephone wire and carried her through the house. Luminol tests showed that Karen's head brushed against the door, leaving a blood smear, later cleaned with detergent. Chris then dropped the body onto the floor and dragged it through the side door and out towards the car. He probably disposed of her body late that night in a deserted location. After returning home, Chris removed all visible traces of blood both inside and out. The DNA analysis showed the blood found on the carpet belonged to Karen Campano. And the medical examiner would testify that Karen Campano suffered horrendous head injuries during the attack which no one could survive. Prosecutors were confident of a conviction even though they didn't have a body or a murder weapon.
Well, I thought it was very likely we might never find the body of the victim.
But just as the preliminary hearing was set to get underway, everything changed. The police found Karen Campano.
This part right here wasn't quite so grown up with all this ivy, and she was laying right down there by that large cottonwood tree, north to south, and there were some blankets around her. There was no greenery at that time. If there had been greenery at that time, you'd never know she was there.
The body lay in a remote area off a major interstate highway until some youngsters on dirt bikes stumbled across it.
All we knew was that we had a female's body out there. We had no idea who it was. Of course, we were hoping it was Karen, but we didn't know.
There was another important find. Police discovered a piece of a check underneath the body. Although they couldn't determine to whom the check was issued, it was from the Shell Oil Company and mailed to someone in New York. The check was for $83.34. Karen Campano was from New York, and her family had a part interest in a gas station there.
This was the first definitive piece that we had, that we knew at that point there was a great possibility that it was Karen. And of course, we wouldn't know for sure until they made identification through dental records and DNA.
Dr. Tom Glass heads the Forensic Odontology Department at the University of Oklahoma. With the help of Karen Campano's dental records and an almost complete set of teeth found in the skull of the body, Dr. Glass's task was fairly easy.
What I do in making the comparison then is simply go frame by frame by frame of the patient's ante-mortem dental x-rays, the x-rays made by the dentist, with the frames of the same areas made on the skeletonized remains. She had a very thorough dentist who documented what he had done. And that documentation allowed the identification in Karen Campano's case to be very profound.
And a DNA analysis of the bone marrow confirmed it. The last doubts had been removed.
Personally, I'm glad she was eventually found because of the family back in New York. I talked to them at length over the phone. Later on during the investigation, I met them. They're really great people, and I really had strong feelings for them, hoping one day she would be found so they could put their own fears to rest and give her a decent burial.
And Christopher Campano confessed. The remarkable thing about it, the autopsy confirmed the prosecution's theory of how Karen died. And that theory, remember, was based only on the luminol, the blood spatter analysis, and the blood volume tests.
The maxilla were fractured, the mandibles were fractured, the nose was fractured, the sinuses were fractured, the skull was extensively fractured, yet the cervical spine was intact, and there were only 3 fractures in the ribs. So this is not the hallmark of somebody that's been run over by a car, or somebody who's had a train wreck, or something like that. This is the hallmark of someone who has sustained a severe beating about the head and face. So it was obvious that this was an assault.
Police and forensic science had solved a difficult puzzle.
It all told a story. It was just more of the pieces of the puzzle coming together, even all the way to the end when the body was actually found. It's like, you know, we've got most of the puzzle there. You know what it is. Even with some missing pieces, you know what it is. But then with that body found, it was like that was the very last piece that just fit in there.
In January of 1994, a year and a half after Karen was killed, Christopher Campano went on trial for his life. His defense attorney couldn't refute the forensic findings. They were just too strong.
Once I had decided to make that leap and embrace the evidence, then my task became easier. It was a matter then of looking at the psychological aspects of the case rather than the hard forensics of the case. I suggested to the judge and jury if it was going to be deliberately planned out and methodical, that kind of blood wouldn't be there. There would be none in the house probably. The homicide would have occurred elsewhere if it had been a cold-blooded killing.
The jury bought at least part of the argument. It found Campano guilty of manslaughter, not the first-degree murder charge the state was seeking.
I feel sorry for it. I feel sorry for what I did to her. Can't bring her back, you know. I just got to pay for what I've done.
Christopher Campano was sentenced to 1,000 years in prison. Shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It might have been just another statistic, but the crime committed that night launched a new era in police investigations. This is how DNA evidence and psychological profiling helped catch a serial killer and set an innocent man free.
Everything about her was very gentle. She was very soft-spoken. Just had this amazing softness about her, this human quality.
44-year-old Susan Tucker was a publications editor who worked for the United States Forestry Service. She was spending the Thanksgiving holiday alone since her husband Reggie was out of the country in Wales on a business trip.
Neither of us could put the phone down. We kept saying, "I love you." And we said this over and over again. I don't know how many times.
But without explanation, telephone calls went unanswered. And neighbors noticed her bedroom window wide open in the cold November weather, so they called police. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was ajar. Inside, a woman's purse was lying on the foyer floor.
I arranged calling the Monday. Couldn't get an answer, just rang.
Tucker.
I rang again. I rang again. I don't know how many times I rang.
Susan Tucker's badly decomposed body was lying face down on the bed. She had been dead for 4 or 5 days.
Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet were tied, the head hanging over the side of the bed almost.
She had been strangled and possibly raped.
It appeared that the killer more than likely was inside the home for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't just a very, quick in and out type of a situation. Many of the drawers had been, ransacked, had been gone through.
When Reggie Tucker first heard the news, he was devastated.
She said, "Sir, I've got bad news." And I knew it. I just knew it at that point. I just, my whole world just fell away.
Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit was quickly assigned to the case. His task wouldn't be easy. For one thing, the killer had been careful. He had worn gloves and left no fingerprints.
Hey, this has been wiped clean.
It had been raining on the night of the murder, and he meticulously cleaned the area around his point of entry.
He's smart enough to know that footprints, which is what we would have gotten from that, would maybe come back to haunt him, which kind of tells you maybe some past experience on burglaries.
Police collected the sheets, nightgown, and the large sleeping bag which covered Susan Tucker's body to look for possible blood and semen stains. They found hairs on the bedding around Susan Tucker's body, in the bathroom sink, and on a washcloth discovered outside on the clothesline. And they gathered shards of broken glass from the basement window. Everything was taken to the forensics lab for analysis, but perhaps the most important clue was also the most obvious: the rope and knots used to strangle Susan Tucker. The police were convinced they had seen this killer's work before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Carolyn Hom had been raped and strangled in her home only 4 blocks away from Susan Tucker. The killer entered the Hom residence the same way, through a basement window, and tied his victim using the same knots.
And it's not a common occurrence, not common at all, to see victims killed by using ligatures to strangle them, ropes tying up victims. It's really quite rare.
But the Hom case was closed when this man, David Vasquez, confessed to her murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Could he have had an accomplice? Horga spoke to him for several hours.
And from the way he was talking and everything and answering my questions, I didn't think he knew a damn thing about Carolyn Hom's murder.
While Detective Horgas began his search for Susan Tucker's killer, 100 miles away in the capital city of Richmond, police there were investigating a series of murders shockingly similar.
The body of 35-year-old Debbie Davis was found inside her South Richmond apartment. She'd been raped and strangled.
In less than a month, 2 young women had been raped and strangled in their homes just a few blocks from each other.
In each case, there was a forced entry, with the murderer entering by cutting the screens and entering through an open window. Each victim was strangled. Both victims were white, between the ages of 30 and 35 years.
2 weeks later, he struck again, this time a 15-year-old girl raped and strangled in her bedroom while her family was sleeping. All 3 had been bound, raped, and strangled with rope. The knots were identical to the ones used in the Arlington cases. Detective Horgas suspected that the killer of Susan Tucker was the same man who murdered Carolyn Hom and the 3 women in Richmond. If Horgas was correct, a serial murderer was loose on a 100-mile killing spree. Detective Horgas believed the man who raped and strangled Susan Tucker had also murdered Carolyn Hom 3 years earlier. Horgas also believed the same man was responsible for the 3 rapes and murders in Richmond, 100 miles away. The Richmond police weren't so sure.
I mean, they have 3 murders that were within a couple miles square radius, I'm guessing, or maybe even less, that, you know, and now we're trying to say that 100 miles away, we're trying to link something to theirs. It's like, hey, get out of here. I mean, this is a local guy.
Horgas was a man, he was the perfect man for this case because he was obsessed. He knew something was wrong.
Author Paul Moniz wrote a best-selling book entitled Stalking Justice. It profiles the rapes and murders of these 5 women and the history-making investigation which followed.
Joe Horgas is motivated by the hunt. He's not a guy who's obsessed by issues of right and wrong, except for his own internal moral compass, which tells him if there's an innocent man in prison, I don't care if we got the guilty guy, we got to get the innocent man out. And he was determined to get this guy.
But if Horgas was right, that all of these murders were connected, he needed proof. For that, he turned to the forensics lab, where scientists were examining the stains found on Susan Tucker's nightgown and bedding.
I found 4 semen stains, and when I analyzed the sleeping bag, I found one very large semen stain. I typed all of those stains.
The semen came from an individual with type O blood and a PGM1 enzyme profile. Although this matched 13% of the population, it also matched the semen found at the Carolyn Hamm murder scene. Next, they turned their attention to the hair found at the Tucker crime scene.
And there are characteristics, microscopically, that can classify hair into one of 3 racial categories,
which are Caucasian, Negroid, or Mongoloid. The hairs found at the Tucker crime scene appeared to be pubic and did not appear to be from the victim or her husband. They were positively identified as Negroid in origin. This was another possible link to the Carolyn Hamm murder case. 3 years earlier, at the time of Hamm's murder, a black male wearing a mask had raped a number of women in the same neighborhood. The masked rapist was never apprehended, and Horgus always suspected that there was a connection to the Hamm murder.
Actually, the same day that Carolyn Hamm's body was found, another girl, lady, was in her house, and this black male with a mask and a knife burglarized her house, got her, and actually he did some sexual activity with her.
The Richmond police and later the Arlington police both sought help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. This unit has interviewed hundreds of serial killers to learn what similarities exist in their psychological makeup. They were able to predict a number of important things about the killer.
We get in and look at the behavior that's left by the offender in the commission of his crime. We believe that by looking at that behavior, we can interpret the type of offender that may have committed the crime.
The fact that the strangler attacked his victims in their homes suggested that he had stalked them first and knew precisely when to strike. The FBI concluded that the perpetrator was between the age of 18 and 30, the quiet type, a loner who held a menial job. He probably had a troubled relationship with his mother and began his crime spree with arson. Historically, many serial rapists and murderers begin with arson. Serial killers are usually white, but could be any race. He lived or worked close to where he committed his first crimes. That's because criminals begin their crime sprees in an area where they feel most comfortable. He took sadistic pleasure in strangling his victims. He would periodically release the bindings so he could hear his victim plead for her life.
It appeared that the perpetrator had intended the victim to suffer considerably. In one case, a shoe impression was found on the victim's back.
These women were obviously first just terrified to the very bone, and then were systematically sexually assaulted. And at the end, and it's not clear whether they were dead when he did this or alive, but he also masturbated on his victims.
And it was these semen samples which would prove to be extremely important pieces of evidence.
I can remember our prosecutor, Helen Fahey, a couple of days after the murder, asking me if this was going to be a DNA case. And I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know what we had got yet.
In 1987, when Susan Tucker was murdered, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. The first time DNA evidence was used in a criminal case was only a year earlier in England, when DNA from a semen sample was used to convict a bakery worker with the rape and murder of 2 15-year-old girls. Horgus decided to try this new DNA testing, sending the semen stains from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the Life Codes laboratory in New York. Forensic scientists were concerned that the samples may have degraded or been contaminated.
You basically isolate the DNA, you cut it up, you generate profiles or patterns, and you then generate these patterns on a piece of X-ray film. So it's like a picture of the DNA. And when you then compare these pictures and the components are the same in the two DNAs, that would indicate that they're from the same source.
The final results from the DNA tests would take up to 10 weeks, but Detective Horgus still didn't have a suspect. Detective Horgus suspected that the same individual who raped and murdered Susan Tucker and Carolyn Hahn 3 years earlier was the masked rapist who was committing crimes in the same area but was never caught. So Horgus drove out to an area of Arlington known as Green Valley, the area where the masked rapist committed his first assaults. The FBI told Horgus that rapists usually commit their first crime close to home.
If the first rape was the first rape for this guy, then he would have lived around there, and that was very crucial to me because I didn't know that.
And as he drove through Green Valley, Horgus tried to recall the names or faces of likely suspects, young men he'd run across over the years who came from that area.
And it just so happens that Detective Horgus started to focus on this one juvenile he had dealt with or remembered him. He just couldn't place the name.
And all I could remember was Timmy. I could see his face. I remembered the approximate time period and everything that I remembered him from, but I couldn't remember his last name.
So we were running all these names through the computer, seeing when they'd been locked up and released. And suddenly he just came in and he said, Spencer, Timothy Spencer, that's the name.
And I saw where he was arrested on January the 29th, 1984, which was 4 days after Carolyn Hahn, her body was found.
Spencer's history unfolded. In trouble as a teenager, he had a string of burglary convictions, and even more surprising, just as the FBI predicted, Spencer had first drawn police attention for arson, for setting fire to his mother's car.
He was presently in a halfway house in Richmond. Well, wow, that's exciting now.
Spencer was on probation, living in this halfway house just a short distance from where the Richmond murders took place. And according to house records, Spencer had been signed out during the Thanksgiving holiday, visiting his mother in Arlington, the week Susan Tucker was murdered.
The fact that he got out of prison 2 weeks before the first murders down in Richmond, the fact that he was available for every murder, the fact that he came to Arlington when he did for our murder.
And the FBI was correct about another important detail. Spencer lived in the area where the first rape was committed.
And that happened over there. And at the time, Timothy Spencer was living down here over this hill.
In his mother's house, barely a mile from the homes of Carolyn Hahn and Susan Tucker. On January 20th, 1988, police arrested Timothy Spencer. Within hours, they had collected a blood sample, some of his hair, and confiscated his clothing for forensic analysis.
The clothing was scraped down for removing any debris, and once that debris was collected, it was taken to a microscope. Several dozen particles of glass were removed from the debris that was removed from his clothing.
The glass fragments were of particular interest to the police. After police recovered glass particles from Spencer's clothing, they were examined forensically to see if they matched glass from any of the victims' homes. One technique is called glass refraction analysis. By shining light from different points on the spectrum through the particles, the characteristics of the glass can be plotted on a graph, in effect measuring how the particles bend light.
If you stick the pen into the water, which is more dense than the air, it bends the light. What we're doing with the glass particle basically is measuring how much the light is bent in and we call it refractive index.
They compared the glass fragments found on Spencer's clothing to the glass particles taken from the broken window at Susan Tucker's home.
We were able to say that that glass that was removed from Spencer's clothing either came from that particular pane or that particular source of glass or another source of glass that had the same optical characteristics.
When scientists completed the DNA analysis of the semen stain found at the Susan Tucker crime scene, they made a chilling discovery.
And I remember pulling out an X-ray film from the developer and holding it up from these two separate cases and being bombarded immediately that the patterns I'm seeing are the same. I'm seeing the same profile on this case from one county versus this case from a second county, which says to me that the same person is involved in both of those incidents. It really gave you chills up and down your spine to see something like that.
Horgus was right all along. The semen sample from the individual who raped and presumably murdered Susan Tucker matched the semen stains from the murders in Richmond.
There were 7 hairs that were consistent with his. There was a glass fragment that was consistent with his. His family couldn't provide him with a complete alibi for the entire weekend.
And finally, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples from the crime victims.
Once we got a sample from Mr. Spencer to test, we generated a profile that was the same as the profile we got from the evidentiary samples. We had a frequency of occurrence of greater than 1 in a million. So that means that only one person in a million in the population would have that particular genetic profile.
And starting with the first result, the blood type, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match.
On July 11, 1988, Timothy Spencer went on trial for his life. It was the first time in the United States where DNA evidence would be used in a serial murder case. It took the jury less than 7 hours to find Timothy Spencer guilty of rape and capital murder. He was sentenced to death.
I feel some kind of relief, but I'll never have my wife back. That's really the bottom line, is I'll never really feel happy. I can't feel happy about somebody being guilty of raping and murdering my wife. I can't feel happy about that. So whatever anger I feel, I will feel till I die.
Death was pronounced by the attending physician at 11:13 p.m. There were no complications. Mr. Spencer did not make a last statement. Thank you.
Up until his death, I don't think that Timothy Spencer made the connection between semen and blood. I don't think he knew that the same DNA that's in your semen is in your blood.
Without DNA, it would have been impossible to convict Timothy Spencer. If he had committed those murders a year or 2 years earlier, he could not have been convicted. In fact, if this had been 1984 or 1985, we probably would not even have arrested him.
Some people ask the question, will DNA fingerprinting replace detective work? I don't think so. Susan Tucker left Detective Horgus the crime scene, and Timothy Spencer left part of himself at the crime scene. But his name would never have come up if it wasn't for Detective Horgus.
New York 1987 cold case breakthrough. Retired detective's clue exposes unexpected killer. There are cities that never sleep. Then there's New York, a city that never forgets. Because long after people move away, long after buildings are renovated, long after witnesses grow old and memories begin to dissolve, some stories remain trapped beneath layers of concrete, waiting for the exact moment to crawl back into the light. This story began in the winter of 1987. A bitterly cold morning. A quiet Brooklyn side street. A layer of dirty snow pressed against the sidewalks. At 6:42 a.m., a delivery driver turned a corner and saw something that would haunt New York for decades. A young woman, 26 years old, lying beside a fire escape, motionless. Her coat was still buttoned. Her purse remained nearby. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked chaotic. And that was the first thing detectives found disturbing. Because crime scenes are supposed to be messy. Violence leaves fingerprints. Fear leaves traces. Panic leaves evidence. But this scene felt almost untouched. Too untouched. As if someone had carefully removed the chaos itself. Police arrived within minutes. Sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Yellow tape stretched across the sidewalk. Residents gathered at windows. Reporters rushed toward the scene. Detectives began walking slow circles around an invisible puzzle. At first, They believed answers would come quickly. New York was crowded. Thousands of people had passed through the area overnight. Someone had to know something. Someone had to have seen something. But that confidence disappeared within hours. Witness statements started pouring in. One person reported hearing a brief argument. Another said the street was completely silent. One witness remembered a dark sedan parked nearby. Another swore there were no vehicles at all. Nothing aligned. Nothing connected. Every answer created two new questions. The victim's final 24 hours were reconstructed immediately. Work. Phone calls. Her apartment. Friends. Routine activities. Everything looked normal. Painfully normal. There were no threats. No recent conflicts. No signs of fear. No indication she intended to disappear. It was as if reality itself had been interrupted. And that terrified investigators more than anything. Because when a life suddenly stops without warning, someone usually controls the interruption. The lead detective assigned to the case was 34-year-old Michael Donovan. Sharp. Disciplined. Obsessive. The kind of investigator who trusted details more than people. He had worked homicide for years, but something about this case refused to leave his mind. Every night, he returned to the photographs. Every morning, he reread witness interviews. Every spare moment was spent looking for patterns hidden inside contradictions. Then he noticed something unusual. A witness had described a man. Not suspicious. Not aggressive. Not frightened. Just quiet. Too quiet. The witness said he stood near the scene before police arrived. He didn't help. He didn't panic. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched, then disappeared into the crowd. At the time, investigators dismissed it. This was New York. Millions of strangers passed one another every day. Being quiet wasn't a crime. The man became a footnote inside an already growing file. Weeks passed, then months. Searches expanded. Resources increased. Detectives knocked on thousands of doors. Every possible lead was explored. Nothing worked. The city moved on. But the family never did. Every anniversary reopened the wound. Every birthday became another reminder. Every Christmas became another unanswered question. Meanwhile, Detective Donovan became increasingly consumed by one thought. The quiet man. He couldn't explain why. There was no evidence. No photograph. No name. No address. Only instinct. And instinct is dangerous inside an investigation. Because instinct can either solve a case or destroy one. So he buried the thought. Years passed. Then 10 years. Then 15. Then 20. Technology evolved. DNA science improved. Entire police departments changed. Detectives retired. Witnesses died. The city transformed itself. But one thing remained frozen in time. The file. Eventually, it was moved into cold case archives. Rows of shelves. Dust-covered boxes. Yellowed photographs. Forgotten names. The graveyard of unanswered questions. Most cold cases never return. Most simply wait until everyone involved disappears. But this one refused to die. Because some investigations don't end. They hibernate. In 2024, Michael Donovan was 71 years old. Retired. Living alone. Far away from police stations and interrogation rooms. But one snowy evening, he opened an old storage box. Inside sat a black notebook. His notebook. The one he carried in 1987. Page after page of handwritten observations. Maps. Phone numbers. Sketches. Tiny details nobody else had ever seen. Then suddenly, he froze. One sentence. Just one sentence. Written in hurried ink 37 years earlier. Too calm to be an ordinary witness. He stared at it for nearly a minute, his heartbeat accelerating. Because during all these years, nobody had ever revisited that observation. Nobody. Not once. Then a horrifying question entered his mind. What if he was never a witness? What if he had always been the killer? The room fell silent. The snow outside continued falling. 37 years of dust suddenly felt alive again. Michael grabbed his phone. He called the Cold Case Division. And at that exact moment, without anyone realizing it, an invisible countdown began. Because somewhere in New York, someone who had lived quietly for nearly 4 decades was about to discover that time is the one detective that never retires, and the past never truly stays buried. There is something terrifying about old cases that suddenly wake up because they do not return gently. They return violently, dragging decades of forgotten details back into the present all at once. And in New York, 37 years after a woman was found dead on a cold Brooklyn sidewalk, a single sentence written inside an old notebook was about to disrupt an entire history everyone thought was beyond repair. Michael Donovan sat in his apartment for hours staring at those words. Too calm to be an ordinary witness. He had written thousands of observations throughout his career. Most meant nothing. Many were wrong. Some led nowhere. But this one was different. He could feel it, not because it proved anything, but because he remembered how uncomfortable it had made him feel back then. Police instincts are strange. They don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they arrive as discomfort, a feeling, an invisible alarm that never fully turns off. The next morning, Michael walked into the New York Cold Case Division carrying a box that looked older than some of the detectives working there. Dust covered the edges. The paper inside had turned yellow, but his eyes looked younger than they had in years. He met Detective Sarah Bennett, 43 years old, one of the department's leading cold case investigators. Practical, methodical, skeptical. She listened carefully as Michael explained his theory. No accusations. No assumptions. Just one forgotten observation. One quiet man. One unexplained instinct. At first, she wasn't convinced. Cold cases are dangerous. Investigators can become obsessed with meaningless details. Memory can transform over decades. People unintentionally rewrite history. She knew all of that. But she also respected something else. Experience. And Michael Donovan had solved over 100 homicide investigations throughout his career. His instincts deserved another look. The team reopened the original witness interviews. Boxes were brought from archives. Thousands of pages were digitized. Every testimony was entered into modern analytical software. And then something unexpected happened. The quiet man appeared again. Not once. 3 times. 3 separate witnesses had mentioned him. But because each description was slightly different, detectives in 1987 had never connected them. One person described a man standing near a newspaper stand. Another described someone watching from across the street. Another remembered a man who walked away before police arrived. Different descriptions. Different angles. Different times. But modern software didn't see 3 people. It saw one movement pattern. One individual. One presence. And suddenly the atmosphere inside the room changed. Detectives stopped speaking casually. The case stopped feeling old. Because this was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was an active hunt. The city outside continued moving normally. Millions of people commuting. Subways roaring underground. Traffic flooding the avenues. Nobody realized a ghost from 1987 had just re-entered the investigation. The team began reconstructing the entire timeline from scratch. Every minute, every movement, every possibility. The victim left work. She made a phone call. She boarded a train. She exited onto a familiar street. Then something happened. Something small. Something invisible. A deviation. Nothing dramatic. No screaming. No chassis. Just a subtle interruption in routine. And interruptions are where killers live. The detectives discovered something else. The victim's route home had changed that night. Only slightly. 3 extra minutes. 1 unnecessary turn. 1 additional block. At first glance, meaningless. But random movement is rarely random. Especially when it becomes the final movement of a person's life. Then another clue emerged. An old security camera from a nearby bank had been dismissed decades earlier because the footage quality was terrible. Technology in 1987 was primitive, but modern enhancement software could now stabilize images. The team sent the tape for digital reconstruction. Days later, the results arrived. The footage was grainy, distorted, almost unusable. But there was something there. A figure, standing still, watching, not approaching, not leaving, simply waiting. The timestamp showed only 4 minutes before the victim entered the area where she would later be found. Michael stared at the screen. His stomach tightened. He recognized the posture, not the person, the behavior, stillness. Predators often make one mistake. They become too comfortable. Comfort removes urgency. Urgency creates mistakes. This person wasn't nervous. He wasn't improvising. He looked prepared. And that realization sent a wave of unease through everyone in the room. Because spontaneous killers behave differently. This felt controlled. Then Detective Bennett noticed another anomaly. The figure disappeared in a direction that investigators had never previously explored. Not toward traffic. Not toward public transportation. But toward a quieter residential section of Brooklyn. The team expanded the search area. Property records. Historical phone books. Employment databases. Old tax records. Everything. Thousands of names flooded the system. Most were eliminated immediately. Some remained. And among them, one profile quietly emerged. Ordinary. Painfully ordinary. No criminal record. No violent history. No public scandals. No red flags. Just a man who had lived a quiet life for nearly 4 decades. Married. Employed. Respected. Invisible. And invisibility is often the most dangerous disguise of all. Because monsters rarely announce themselves. They blend in. Meanwhile, Michael couldn't sleep. Every night, he replayed the original crime scene inside his head. The snow. The fire escape. The empty street. The quiet man. Then suddenly another memory resurfaced. A detail he had completely forgotten. During the original investigation, someone had returned to the scene 3 days later. No reason. No purpose. No explanation. The person had simply stood there for a few minutes, then left. At the time, detectives ignored it. Now, it felt enormous. Because killers sometimes revisit their crimes. Not out of guilt, but out of ownership. The team checked old reports. And there it was. The same description. Tall. Calm. Silent. The quiet man again. The room became silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Because everyone understood the same terrifying truth at the exact same moment. This was never a stranger who accidentally witnessed a crime. This was someone who had been close enough to watch it unfold. Close enough to return afterward. Close enough to hide for 37 years. And somewhere in New York, that person was still alive. Still waking up every morning. Still drinking coffee. Still walking through crowded streets unnoticed. Completely unaware that an old detective's forgotten note had just reopened a door that time itself had tried to seal shut. And once that door opens, it never closes quietly. There is a dangerous moment in every cold case when the investigation stops looking backward and begins moving forward again, because once a forgotten clue starts connecting to real people in the present, time no longer protects anyone, and in New York, 37 years after a murder had disappeared beneath layers of dust and bureaucracy, detectives were no longer studying history. They were closing in on someone who was still alive. The suspect's identity remained hidden inside internal reports. No public announcements. No media leaks. No headlines. Just a small team of investigators sitting inside a room where every minute felt heavier than the last. On the screen was a face. Ordinary. Gray hair. Wrinkles. A retired life. Nothing about him stood out. Nothing about him suggested violence. That was the unsettling part. People often imagine killers as monsters. But monsters rarely survive 40 years without being noticed. The ones who do survive become experts at appearing normal. His name had quietly surfaced through overlapping historical records. Property documents. Employment files. Old utility registrations. Everything pointed toward one undeniable fact. In 1987, he had been exactly where investigators now believed he needed to be. At the exact right time. Close enough to matter. But proximity alone was not enough. Detectives needed more. Much more. Meanwhile, Michael Donovan sat silently in the corner of the room. 37 years had aged his body, but not his memory. He kept staring at the enhanced footage, the figure standing still, watching, waiting. Then he said something that immediately changed the atmosphere. He wasn't looking for her. The room fell silent. Detective Sarah Bennett turned toward him. What do you mean? Michael leaned forward. If he was stalking her specifically, he'd be moving. Everyone looked back at the footage. The figure never paced, never searched, never looked around nervously. He simply stood there, waiting, as if he already knew exactly where she would appear. That observation sent a shockwave through the investigation, because it meant something terrifying. This wasn't random. This was an opportunity. This might have been planning. The victim's final route was reconstructed again, this time with extreme precision. Every street, every intersection, every possible delay. Then another anomaly emerged. The victim had left work 7 minutes later than usual that night. 7 minutes. Nothing significant, except one horrifying detail. The mysterious man was already there, waiting, which meant he couldn't have been reacting. He had anticipated her arrival. The room became quieter than before, because anticipation means familiarity. Familiarity means connection. And connection means the investigation had missed something massive in 1987. The detectives immediately reopened every relationship surrounding the victim. Coworkers, neighbors, friends, family acquaintances, store owners, delivery drivers, building employees, everyone. Then another invisible thread appeared. The suspect and the victim had crossed paths before. Not closely, not socially, but repeatedly. Over months. Small encounters. The kind nobody remembers. Passing through the same coffee shop. Walking through the same train station. Sharing similar schedules. Tiny intersections. Harmless. Forgettable. Unless someone was paying attention. And suddenly a chilling theory emerged. What if he had been watching her long before the murder? Not obsessively. Not dramatically. Quietly. Patiently. The way predators often do. Meanwhile, detectives obtained old photographs from local newspapers, community events, street festivals, public gatherings. Thousands of images were processed through facial enhancement software. Then something unbelievable happened. There he was, standing in the background. 1 year before the murder. Again. 6 months before. Again. 3 weeks before. Always distant. Always silent. Always watching. Nobody had noticed him. Because he never demanded attention. He mastered invisibility. And invisibility is powerful. Because nobody fears what they never see. Meanwhile, surveillance teams began quietly monitoring him in the present. No arrests. No contact. Just observation. And what they discovered made everyone uncomfortable. His life was ordinary. Extremely ordinary. He woke up at the same time every day. Bought groceries. Read newspapers. Walked slowly through parks. Spoke politely to neighbors. Nothing suspicious. Nothing alarming. The perfect disguise. But detectives understand something the public often doesn't. Normality is not evidence of innocence. Sometimes it's evidence of practice. Years of practice. Decades of practice. Back at headquarters, another breakthrough arrived. An evidence technician reopened a sealed envelope from 1987. Inside was a tiny fiber sample collected from the victim's coat. At the time, technology couldn't analyze it properly. Now it could. The laboratory began processing immediately. Days passed. Then the results came back. The fiber was rare. Very rare. Not unique. But uncommon enough to reduce thousands of possibilities into hundreds. The source? A specific type of industrial fabric used in a company where the suspect had worked in 1987. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The walls felt smaller. The room felt colder. Because this was no longer instinct. This was no longer coincidence. The invisible walls protecting the past were beginning to collapse. Then something even stranger happened. Detective Bennett discovered that the suspect had never once spoken publicly about the murder. Not once. For 37 years. Most people in the neighborhood remembered the tragedy. Many discussed it over the decades. He never did. Absolute silence. And silence itself became suspicious. Because humans remember traumatic community events. Even innocent people do. But he had erased it entirely, as if speaking about it would force something dangerous back into existence. Meanwhile, Michael Donovan couldn't shake another thought. What if the killer had believed he was safe forever? What if every passing year had reinforced that belief? Safe. 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 Still safe. Until now. Until one old notebook. Until one forgotten sentence. Until one detective refused to let discomfort die. Outside, New York remained unaware. Millions of people crossed sidewalks every hour. Subways thundered beneath the city. The lights never stopped glowing. Nobody realized that a man hidden in plain sight for nearly 4 decades was beginning to lose the protection time had given him. Because time protects everyone. Until suddenly, it doesn't. And somewhere inside that ordinary life, for the very first time in 37 years, the past was quietly walking toward him again. There is a moment in every cold case when investigators stop asking whether they are getting closer and begin asking a far more unsettling question. Does he know? Because sometimes the most dangerous stage of an investigation is not the discovery of evidence. It is the collision between awareness and time. And in New York, 37 years after a woman vanished into a single horrifying night, that collision was beginning to form. The surveillance team gathered before sunrise. Nobody spoke much anymore. The energy inside headquarters had changed. The case no longer felt historical. It felt alive. Every movement mattered. Every minute mattered. The suspect left his house at exactly 6:08 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than usual. A small difference. Almost meaningless. But detectives immediately noticed. Because patterns are everything. People who have followed the same routine for years rarely make random adjustments. Especially not repeatedly. He bought coffee. Skipped the newspaper stand. Walked a different route. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But enough to trigger concern. Detective Sarah Bennett watched the footage over and over. Then she said something nobody wanted to hear. Either he's sensing something, or he's remembering something. The room fell silent. Because memory can be dangerous. Especially for someone who has successfully buried the past. Sometimes all it takes is one subconscious trigger. One feeling. One invisible shift in the world around them. Back at headquarters, another team continued digging through old records. Thousands of pages. Millions of data points. Then they discovered something odd. The suspect had changed jobs 6 months after the murder. Not unusual. Except for one detail. He had never stayed at one company for more than 7 years ever again. 7 years. Then move. 7 years. Then move again. The pattern repeated itself for decades. Michael Donovan stared at the timeline. His eyes narrowed. Because human beings are creatures of habit. Patterns reveal fears. Patterns reveal secrets. Then he realized something. Every career change happened shortly after major advancements in forensic science. No DNA revolution. Safe. DNA becomes more widely used. He changes jobs. Digital databases expand. He relocates. Advanced forensic technology grows. He moves again. The room became silent. Nobody said it aloud. But everyone thought the same thing. What if he had been adapting for decades? Not hiding physically. Preparing psychologically. Always staying one step ahead of a world that kept becoming smarter. Meanwhile, the laboratory completed another round of analysis. Detectives had quietly collected discarded items during surveillance. A coffee cup. A napkin. A water bottle. The DNA extraction process began immediately. Nobody celebrated. Nobody smiled. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. This was the bridge. The bridge between 1987 and today. Hours passed. Then days. The entire investigation seemed suspended in silence. Waiting. Then the phone rang. The laboratory was ready. Detective Bennett entered the room. No dramatic expression. No excitement. Just seriousness. The result was not a complete match. But it was enough. Enough to continue. Enough to justify escalation. Enough to confirm investigators were no longer chasing shadows. Michael closed his eyes. 37 years. 37 years reduced to a single sentence. We're on the right path. Outside, snow began falling over New York. The same kind of snow that covered Brooklyn in 1987. The city looked beautiful, peaceful, completely unaware that history was quietly rearranging itself beneath its feet. Meanwhile, something else happened. The suspect broke a routine for the first time in years. Instead of going home after lunch, he drove toward Brooklyn. Nobody expected it. Surveillance teams immediately adjusted positions. His movements were calm.
No panic. No urgency.
He parked near the old neighborhood. The same streets, the same fire escape, the exact area where the victim was found. The detective stared at the live feed in disbelief. He got out of the car. He stood there, motionless. 37 years later, exactly where it happened. No flowers.
No photographs.
No reason. Just silence. Then he looked around. Not nervous. Not emotional. As if he were checking whether the place still existed. As if he were verifying that reality had not changed. Michael felt a chill run through his body. Because killers sometimes revisit memories. But very few revisit them after 4 decades. Unless something has awakened inside them. The suspect stayed for 6 minutes. Then he left. Nobody approached him. Nobody interrupted him. The team simply watched. Because 6 minutes told them more than 6,000 pages of reports ever could. This place still mattered to him. That alone was enormous. Back at headquarters, analysts reconstructed every second of his visit. Then another shocking discovery emerged. He had stood in almost the exact same position captured by the old bank footage from 1987. Within a few feet, the room went silent. One detective whispered a single sentence. He remembers. Nobody answered. Because there was nothing left to say. The evidence was no longer pointing in different directions. It was converging, like dozens of rivers flowing into one terrifying truth. And truth is dangerous. Because once it begins to emerge, it accelerates. Meanwhile, Michael Donovan sat alone for a moment. He looked at the old notebook. The same notebook that had started all of this. One forgotten sentence. One old instinct. One tiny observation. That was all it took. Then another realization hit him. The suspect had survived because nobody was looking for an extraordinary man. They were looking for an extraordinary monster. But extraordinary monsters are rare. Ordinary monsters. They are much harder to see. And somewhere in New York, for the very first time in nearly 40 years, a man who had mastered invisibility was beginning to lose control of it. Because time had finally caught up.
And time
never arrives empty-handed. There is a strange silence that exists just before a cold case explodes back into public reality, a silence that feels unnatural, as if an entire city is unknowingly holding its breath. And in New York, that silence was beginning to surround a man who had spent 37 years believing he had escaped history forever. Inside headquarters, the investigation entered a new phase. No longer reconstruction. No longer speculation. Containment. The detectives understood something critical. The closer they got, the more dangerous uncertainty became. Because if he sensed pressure, he could disappear. Not physically. Psychologically. People who live with secrets for decades become experts at adaptation. They can erase habits overnight. Destroy memories. Rewrite routines. even without ever knowing exactly what investigators have discovered. The human brain is remarkably efficient at detecting invisible threats. That was why every movement had to be precise. No mistakes, no leaks, no shortcuts. Meanwhile, surveillance continued. The suspect woke up at 6:11 a.m. 3 minutes later than usual. He skipped breakfast. He stood by the kitchen window longer than normal. Then he pulled out an old cardboard box from a closet. The team immediately focused their cameras. Inside the box were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings. He sat there for nearly an hour, reading, touching the papers, staring into nothingness. Nobody knew what he was thinking. But one thing was certain. His routine was changing. And routine only changes when something internal begins to move. Back at headquarters, forensic analysts were rebuilding another timeline. This time, they weren't studying the victim. They were studying him. A quiet employee, moved apartments, changed jobs, changed cities briefly, sold old belongings, destroyed multiple storage boxes. At first glance, meaningless life events, but layered together. A pattern emerged. Every major life adjustment happened after moments of investigative advancement, almost as if he was subconsciously responding to changes in the world. Michael Donovan stared at the chart. Then he whispered something chilling. He never stopped running. Detective Bennett looked at him. But he never left New York. Michael nodded. Exactly. Because running isn't always physical. Sometimes people run inside their own lives. They reorganize themselves. They create distance. They construct new versions of who they are, over and over again, until eventually, even they begin to believe the performance. Meanwhile, another discovery surfaced. An old maintenance worker was located, 82 years old. His memory was fading, but one detail remained crystal clear. Back in 1987, 3 days after the murder, he remembered seeing the same man standing near the fire escape. The man wasn't crying, wasn't praying, wasn't shocked. He was staring. The maintenance worker remembered it because it felt strange, too calm, too still. Then he said something investigators would never forget. It looked like he was checking if something had been missed. The room went silent, because that's exactly what killers sometimes do. They revisit scenes to evaluate risk. Not grief. Not guilt. Risk. The statement immediately became part of the active investigation. Then something else happened. The suspect received an unexpected phone call. Surveillance teams couldn't hear the conversation, but they observed his reaction. He froze. Only for a second. Then he smiled. A fake smile. Tiny. Brief. But enough. Then he ended the call and remained motionless for almost 2 minutes. That terrified investigators. Because stillness often means thinking. Thinking often means calculating. And calculating means danger. The team reviewed the footage repeatedly. His face revealed almost nothing. But one movement stood out. His hand. It trembled. For less than a second. Then returned to normal. That was the first visible crack anyone had seen in 37 years. Meanwhile, detectives obtained permission to deepen surveillance operations. Every movement was documented. Every destination recorded. And then another anomaly appeared. He started driving at night. No destination. No purpose. Just driving. 1 hour. 2 hours. Through Brooklyn. Through Queens. Back into Brooklyn. As if he was searching for something. Or avoiding something. Nobody knew. But detectives understood something else. People under invisible pressure often seek familiarity. They revisit old environments, old memories, old emotions. Because the brain searches for stability when fear begins to emerge. Then came the most unsettling moment yet. At 11:17 p.m., he drove past the original crime scene again. Slowly. Very slowly. He didn't stop. He didn't get out. He simply looked. Then continued driving. Michael stared at the monitor, his face expressionless. Then he quietly said, "He knows something has changed." Nobody answered, because everyone felt it too. Not because the suspect had discovered the investigation, but because something deeper was happening. The past was waking up. And human beings are strangely sensitive to unfinished stories, even when they cannot explain why. Back at headquarters, the case board looked completely different now. What was once an impossible mystery had transformed into a living structure. Every clue connected, every anomaly aligned, every road pointed toward the same man. Yet nobody celebrated, because detectives know the most dangerous part comes at the end, when truth gets close enough to touch, because that's when people become unpredictable. Meanwhile, outside the station, New York glowed beneath thousands of lights. Subways roared, restaurants filled with laughter. People hurried home without realizing history was moving beneath them. Somewhere among millions of ordinary lives, an invisible clock was ticking. 37 years, 13,500 days, hundreds of thousands of quiet moments, all leading to one destination, one collision, one unavoidable reckoning. And for the first time since the winter of 1987, the man who had hidden inside normality for nearly 4 decades was no longer protected by time, because time had changed sides. And once time turns against you, it never turns back. There is a dangerous transformation that happens when a cold case survives long enough to become part of someone's identity, because after decades of silence, the crime no longer exists as a single event. It becomes a hidden second life, buried underneath routines, birthdays, jobs, and ordinary conversations. And in New York, investigators were beginning to understand that they were no longer hunting a memory from 1987. They were hunting an entire lifetime built around that memory. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere had changed again. Nobody referred to him as a person of interest anymore. Nobody said his name unnecessarily. The case had entered a phase detectives know all too well. The final approach. Every decision had consequences. Every delay carried risk. Every mistake could destroy nearly 4 decades of work. Meanwhile, the suspect continued his life as though nothing had changed. Or at least, that was the illusion. Because underneath the surface, subtle fractures were beginning to appear. He started sleeping less. The lights in his house stayed on later. He walked around at night, sometimes stopping in front of windows for several minutes, doing nothing, simply standing there, watching the darkness. Surveillance teams documented everything. And one investigator said something that unsettled everyone. He looks like he's waiting for something. Nobody answered, because nobody knew what he could possibly be waiting for. A phone call? A memory? A knock at the door? The end? Back at headquarters, Detective Sarah Bennett was studying another piece of evidence. The old interview transcript from 1987. She read it again. Then one sentence suddenly caught her attention. A single answer. 6 words. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing dramatic. Yet something felt wrong. In response to a question about where he had been that night, he had said, "I stayed around for a while."
Around.
Not nearby. Not outside. Not on the street.
Around.
The word was vague. Too vague. And vagueness is often intentional. Because people protecting information rarely lie directly. They create distance through language. They soften locations. Blur timelines. Erase precision. Detective Bennett highlighted the sentence. Then another. Then another. The pattern became obvious. He never anchored himself to specific places. Never. 37 years ago, he had already been protecting himself. The realization was chilling, because it meant he wasn't improvising. He was disciplined. Meanwhile, another team examined historical financial records. Nothing suspicious appeared. No sudden spending. No hidden accounts. No secret properties. Then an analyst noticed something bizarre. Every year, on the anniversary of the murder, he withdrew cash. The exact same amount. Every year. 37 years. No explanation. No purpose. Nobody could determine where the money went. But repetition itself was alarming. Humans create rituals around significant events. Birthdays. Holidays.
loss, trauma.
The question was simple. What was he commemorating? Meanwhile, Michael Donovan sat alone in a conference room. The old notebook lay open beside him. 37 years earlier, he had trusted an instinct nobody else could see. Now that instinct had become an investigation. But another thought haunted him. What if this wasn't his only victim? The room suddenly felt colder. Because that possibility changes everything. Detectives immediately expanded the search. Missing persons, unsolved assaults, cold cases, patterns, neighborhoods, timelines. They searched for similarities. Nothing obvious appeared. Then they found something unsettling. 3 separate incidents. Different years, different boroughs, different victims, but all shared one detail. Witnesses described a quiet man nearby, watching, then disappearing. The room fell silent. Nobody rushed to conclusions, because coincidence exists. But 3 coincidences begin to resemble behavior. And behavior creates profiles. Meanwhile, surveillance continued. The suspect visited the library again. 30 minutes. Same chair. Same newspapers. But this time something changed. He stopped reading. He simply stared at an article. Motionless. Investigators zoomed in. The article was about advancements in forensic genealogy. Nobody spoke, because everyone understood immediately. He was reading about the very technology that was slowly destroying his protection. Back at headquarters, another bombshell arrived. The laboratory had completed a deeper DNA analysis. The results were stronger now. Much stronger. The bridge between 1987 and the present was becoming undeniable. Still not enough for public action. But enough to move forward. Enough to prepare. Enough to start planning the inevitable confrontation. Outside, winter returned to New York. Snow gathered along sidewalks. The air looked almost identical to that morning in 1987. The city had changed. Yet somehow it hadn't. The same noise. The same lights. The same endless movement. And somewhere among those millions of lives, a secret was beginning to suffocate under its own weight. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. At exactly 8:17 p.m., the suspect opened a drawer in his home. He removed an old photograph. He stared at it for several minutes. Then he put it back. Surveillance couldn't identify the image. But investigators knew one thing. People don't revisit old objects by accident, especially when pressure begins to rise. Memory was surfacing. And memory is unpredictable, because once it begins moving, it often refuses to stop. Michael leaned back in his chair.
Exhausted.
Older, but strangely calm, because after 37 years, he finally understood something. The killer hadn't escaped justice. He had borrowed time. And borrowed time always comes with interest. Meanwhile, somewhere across New York, inside a perfectly ordinary house, a man was beginning to discover the most terrifying truth imaginable. You can hide from police. You can hide from witnesses. You can hide from evidence. You can even hide from an entire city. But eventually, you run out of places to hide from time itself. And when time finally knocks, it never knocks twice. There is a terrifying calm that settles over an investigation just before everything changes, because by that point, detectives are no longer asking whether the truth exists. They are asking how much time remains before the truth forces its way into the open. And in New York, 37 years after one woman disappeared into a winter night, that moment was getting dangerously close. Inside headquarters, the case board was no longer a collection of disconnected clues. It had become a map. Every line pointed toward the same destination. The quiet man. The witness who was never truly a witness. The invisible figure who had spent decades hiding inside an ordinary life. The team gathered before sunrise. No one spoke casually anymore. There was no excitement.
No celebración.
Only concentration. Because experienced investigators understand something important. The closer you get to the truth, the more fragile everything becomes. One mistake, one leak, one unexpected reaction, and decades of work can disappear. Meanwhile, surveillance teams remained in position. The suspect woke up at 5:53 a.m. Earlier than usual. He sat at the edge of his bed, motionless, for nearly 7 minutes. Then he stood up and opened the curtains. He stared outside, not at anything specific, just outside. Then something unusual happened. He did not turn on the television. He did not make coffee. He simply stood there, watching. The investigators immediately noticed. Routine disruption. Again. And routine disruption means internal change. Detective Bennett wrote a single sentence on her notepad. Pressure is increasing. Back at headquarters, analysts were reviewing his entire life for the 100th time. Every address, every job, every friendship, every movement. Then another hidden detail emerged. He had almost no close relationships. Acquaintances? Yes. Neighbors? Yes. Coworkers? Yes. But true friendships? Almost none. The pattern repeated for decades. Surface-level connections. Nothing deep.
Nothing permanent.
Michael Donovan stared at the screen. Then he quietly said, he built a life designed to survive scrutiny. Everyone looked at him. And he continued. People trust familiarity. He gave everyone just enough of it. That was the frightening part. He wasn't isolated. He wasn't antisocial. He was carefully ordinary. Exactly ordinary enough. Meanwhile, another forensic team re-examined evidence storage. Boxes untouched since 1987. Thousands of items. Then they discovered something tiny. A partial fingerprint. So small it had been considered unusable for decades. Modern technology could now process fragments impossible to analyze in the past. The sample was sent immediately. Nobody celebrated. Nobody moved. Everyone simply waited. Hours passed. Then came the result. The print wasn't complete enough for legal certainty, but it aligned. Again. The room fell silent. Another thread. Another convergence. Another invisible wall collapsing. Meanwhile, surveillance teams observed something unexpected. The suspect drove somewhere he had never visited during the entire operation. A cemetery. The detectives immediately followed.
He parked,
walked slowly, then stopped in front of a grave. Not the victim's grave. A family member's. He stood there for 10 minutes. No flowers. No prayer. Just silence. Then he whispered something. The audio team couldn't capture it, but they captured something else. His face.
For the first time.
Emotion. Not fear. Not sadness. Exhaustion. As if he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Back at headquarters, Michael watched the footage repeatedly. Then he said something nobody expected. He's getting tired. Detective Bennett frowned. Tired of what? Michael looked at her. Tired of holding the secret. The room grew quiet. Because secrets age with people. At 25, they feel manageable. At 40, they become burdens. At 60, they become ghosts. And ghosts never truly leave. Meanwhile, another discovery emerged. An analyst found that he had never once thrown away old newspapers. Thousands of them.
Decades of them.
Boxes upon boxes. Stored carefully. Organized meticulously. And among them were dozens of articles about the 1987 murder. Every update. Every anniversary. Every public appeal. Every failed lead. He had kept them all. Nobody spoke. Because nobody needed to. The meaning was obvious. He never forgot. Not for a single year. Outside, New York continued breathing. Millions of people rushing through their lives. Taxi horns. Subway brakes. Bright lights. Laughter. Arguments.
Life.
Completely unaware that history was quietly preparing to erupt beneath their feet. Meanwhile, inside his house, something changed. The suspect opened an old drawer. Removed a photograph. Then another. Then another. Surveillance couldn't identify them. But detectives could see his hands trembling. Only slightly. But enough. Tiny cracks were beginning to appear. 37 years of control. 37 years of silence. 37 years of invisibility, beginning to fracture. Then Detective Bennett received the call everyone had been waiting for. Authorization. The investigation could move forward. The final phase had been approved. Nobody cheered. Nobody smiled. The room simply became still, because everyone understood what that meant. The distance between the past and the present had almost disappeared.
Soon,
there would be no distance left at all. Michael Donovan sat quietly, the oldest man in the room, the man who had refused to forget, the man whose instinct had survived nearly 4 decades. He looked at the old notebook one last time. Then he closed it, slowly, deliberately, and somewhere across New York, inside a quiet home, a man who had spent 37 years believing history had abandoned him, was running out of tomorrow, because time had finally finished collecting evidence.
And now,
time was coming to collect him. There is a moment in every cold case when history stops feeling distant and begins to breathe inside the present, because once investigators receive authorization to move forward, every second becomes heavier than the one before it. And in New York, 37 years after a young woman vanished into a winter night, the invisible barrier between yesterday and today was finally disappearing. Inside headquarters, nobody spoke above a whisper. The atmosphere was different. Focused, controlled, dangerously calm. The final operational phase had begun. No dramatic announcements.
no flashing headlines.
No reporters. Just detectives quietly preparing for an encounter decades in the making. Every document was reviewed. Every timeline verified. Every piece of evidence checked again. Because at this stage, certainty becomes everything. One mistake could destroy nearly 40 years of work. Meanwhile, the suspect remained unaware. Or at least that was what everyone hoped. He followed his routine.
Coffee.
A walk. The newspaper. A brief stop at a grocery store. Everything looked ordinary. Yet investigators noticed something else. He was moving slower. Much slower. The pauses between actions had increased. He stood longer at intersections. He hesitated before entering buildings. He looked at people more often. Tiny changes. Invisible to everyone else. But not to detectives. Because detectives study rhythm.
And rhythm had changed.
Back at headquarters, Detective Bennett assembled the team. Nobody sat comfortably. Nobody relaxed. Every person in that room understood the weight of what was coming. 37 years. An entire lifetime. About to collide with reality. Then Michael Donovan stood up. His hands slightly shaking. Not from fear. From age. But his voice remained steady. He looked around the room and said something that nobody would forget. Don't underestimate him. Everyone listened. He survived because he adapted. The room remained silent. He may look ordinary, but ordinary people don't survive 37 years inside a lie. Nobody answered. Because he was right. Meanwhile, analysts completed one final reconstruction of 1987. Every street. Every weather condition. Every movement. Every possibility. Then they projected the timeline onto a giant screen. The image was terrifying in its simplicity. The victim. The suspect. One convergence point. One narrow window of time. One irreversible moment. The paths intersected. Then one life ended. Everything pointed there. Everything. Back outside, surveillance teams continued observing. Then something unexpected happened. At exactly 4:12 p.m., the suspect stopped walking. He stood still in the middle of the sidewalk. People moved around him. Nobody noticed. Then he looked upward. Toward nothing. Toward everything. Then he kept walking. The detectives replayed the footage multiple times. Nobody could explain it. But everyone felt uncomfortable. Because human beings sometimes react to pressure before they consciously understand why. Meanwhile, another search warrant was approved. Not for an arrest. Not yet. For historical materials. Storage boxes. Personal records. Old belongings. The operation was planned carefully. No surprises. No mistakes. Every detail mattered. Then another astonishing discovery emerged. Inside decades-old documents, investigators found a receipt. One tiny receipt, dated 2 days after the murder. Nothing unusual about that, except for what was purchased. Cleaning supplies. Industrial grade. The exact same category of residue previously found on the victim's scarf. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Another connection. Another invisible wall collapsing. Meanwhile, Michael sat alone for a moment. He looked exhausted. 40 years of unfinished work had taken a toll. But there was something else in his eyes now. Peace. Because he finally understood something. Justice does not move quickly. Justice moves patiently. Sometimes it moves so slowly that people mistake it for failure. But eventually, it arrives. Back at surveillance, the suspect returned home. He entered his house. Then something unusual happened. He closed every curtain. Every single one. Front windows. Back windows. Kitchen windows. All of them. The team immediately noticed. He had never done that before. Not once. Detective Bennett stared at the monitor. Then quietly said, "He feels something." Nobody argued. Because instinct recognizes instinct. And for the first time since the investigation restarted, the hunter and the hunted were both sensing the same thing. The end was approaching. Meanwhile, New York carried on as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Subways roared beneath the city. Streetlights illuminated the sidewalks. Restaurants filled with conversations. People laughed. People argued. People fell in love. Life continued, unaware that one of the city's oldest ghosts was about to lose its place among the living. Then Michael Donovan received a message. Final operational approval. The room became silent.
No applause. No celebration.
Only understanding. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would change everything. 37 years of waiting. 37 years of silence. 37 years of invisibility. All leading to one inevitable moment. And somewhere inside a quiet house, a man who had borrowed nearly 4 decades from history was about to learn something terrifying. Nothing stays hidden forever. Not evidence. Not memory. Not fear. And certainly not the past. Because the past is patient. And after 37 years, its patience was finally running out. There is a silence that exists only once in an investigation, a silence that arrives when every question has been asked, every clue has been connected, and every possible escape route has disappeared, because at that point, nobody is chasing the truth anymore. The truth is already there. It is simply waiting to be acknowledged. And in New York, 37 years after a winter night had stolen a young woman's future, that moment had finally arrived. Before sunrise, headquarters was already alive. Not with noise. With focus. Phones remained quiet. Computers glowed softly. Detectives reviewed documents one final time. Every person moved with deliberate precision. Because once an operation begins, there is no second attempt. Meanwhile, outside, New York looked ordinary. The city always does. Millions of people preparing for another day. Coffee shops opening. Subways running. Delivery trucks moving through narrow streets. Life continuing without interruption. Nobody realized history was about to return. Inside his house, the suspect woke up at exactly 6:07 a.m. He walked into the kitchen, prepared coffee, opened a newspaper, sat down. Routine. The same routine he had perfected for decades. The same routine that had protected him. The same routine that was about to end. Surveillance teams confirmed positions. Everything was ready. Nobody rushed. Nobody panicked. The operation depended on calm. Because calm is stronger than force. At headquarters, Michael Donovan stood quietly near a window. 37 years. An entire career. An entire lifetime. Condensed into a single morning. Detective Bennett approached him. "Are you ready?" Michael looked outside. Snowflakes drifted through the air. Then he answered, "No." She looked surprised. Michael smiled faintly. People think detectives prepare for moments like this. He paused. "You don't. You just carry them." The room fell silent, because everyone understood. Some cases become personal. Some become permanent. This case had become both. Meanwhile, the suspect finished his coffee. He put on his coat, locked the front door, and stepped outside. The surveillance team immediately activated. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Then, for a split second, he stopped. He looked down the street. Nobody moved. Nobody revealed themselves. But somehow, he hesitated. Only for a moment. Then he kept walking. The detectives exchanged glances. Instinct. Again. People sometimes sense change without understanding why. The operation continued. Step by step. Distance closed slowly. No sudden movements.
No unnecessary risks.
Years of patience demanded precision. Then the moment arrived. Investigators approached. Professional.
Calm.
Measured. No raised voices. No chaos. Just reality finally introducing itself. The suspect looked at them. Expressionless. One detective identified himself. Another explained why they were there. Then something happened that nobody expected. The suspect smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a nervous smile. A tired smile. The kind people wear when something inevitable finally reaches them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then he said 6 words. I wondered when this would happen. The world seemed to stop. Michael Donovan stood frozen. 37 years collapsed into a single sentence. Because those words changed everything. Innocent people say many things. Confused people ask questions. Surprised people deny. But this sounded different. This sounded like recognition. The suspect remained calm. Too calm. The same calmness witnesses described in 1987. The same calmness Michael had written down all those years ago. Nothing had changed. Except one thing. He was no longer invisible. Meanwhile, the city kept moving. People crossed intersections. Taxi horns echoed. Subways thundered beneath Manhattan. Nobody knew that one of New York's oldest ghosts had finally stepped into the light. Inside headquarters later that day, investigators prepared for questioning. No celebrations. No victory speeches. Because they all understood something. An arrest is not an ending. It is a doorway. The final truth still had to emerge.
And truth is complicated.
Sometimes it arrives quickly. Sometimes it resists. Sometimes it never fully reveals itself at all. Meanwhile, the suspect sat alone, hands folded, breathing slowly. 37 years of silence surrounding him. Then Michael entered the room. The two men stared at each other. One had spent decades searching. The other had spent decades hiding. Neither spoke immediately, because some moments are too heavy for words. Then Michael sat down.
His voice calm.
His expression unreadable. He opened the old notebook. The same notebook. The same page. The same sentence. Too calm to be an ordinary witness. He placed it on the table. The suspect stared at it. Then his eyes changed. Not fear. Not panic. Recognition. For the first time in 37 years. The past was no longer a memory. It was sitting in front of him. Alive. Waiting. Demanding answers. And somewhere deep inside New York, time itself had finally finished the investigation it started decades ago. Because time never forgets. Time never gets tired.
And time
always comes back to collect what it is owed. There are some stories that never truly end because an investigation can close, an arrest can happen, and evidence can be presented, yet the silence left behind continues to echo for years. And in New York, 37 years after a woman disappeared into a freezing winter night, everyone was about to discover that solving a cold case does not erase its scars. It simply gives those scars a name. Inside the interrogation room, nothing looked dramatic. No shouting. No slammed fists. No cinematic confession. Just two men sitting across from each other. One had spent his life searching for truth. The other had spent his life hiding from it. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above them. The old notebook remained open on the table. The same sentence. The same instinct. The same 6 words that had survived nearly 4 decades. Too calm to be an ordinary witness. The suspect stared at them. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Nobody interrupted him. Because experienced detectives understand something. Silence is often louder than questions. Eventually he leaned back. His shoulders looked heavier than before. 37 years heavier. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. And for the first time since this investigation had returned to life, he looked old. Truly old. Not physically. Emotionally. As though an invisible weight he had carried for decades was finally crushing him. Outside the room, investigators watched quietly. Nobody celebrated. Nobody smiled. Because this was never about winning. This was about ending something that should have ended a lifetime ago. Michael Donovan sat perfectly still. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He simply looked tired. The kind of tiredness that only unfinished work can create. Then the suspect spoke.
His voice calm.
The same calmness. The same unsettling composure that had haunted Michael since 1987. I thought everyone forgot. The words landed heavily. Nobody answered immediately. Because forgetting was the entire reason this case had survived so long. Not because people didn't care. Not because investigators failed. But because time is powerful. Time buries headlines. Time erases faces. Time moves entire cities forward. And eventually, people stop looking backward. But Michael never did. That was the difference. One detective refused to let discomfort disappear. One sentence refused to die. One instinct refused to surrender. The suspect looked at the notebook again. Then he spoke softly. 37 years. Nobody corrected him. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone understood what those years meant. 37 birthdays. 37 winters. 37 Christmas mornings. 37 opportunities to come forward. None taken. Meanwhile, outside headquarters, news crews had begun gathering. Rumors were spreading. Social media exploded with speculation. Old photographs resurfaced. Headlines returned. The city remembered. People who had been children in 1987 were now grandparents. People who once searched for answers were now elderly. Some had already passed away. Never knowing the truth had finally returned. That reality hit everyone hard. Because justice delayed is still painful, even when it finally arrives. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together the final gaps. Some answers emerged. Some remained hidden. That is the nature of old cases. Memory deteriorates. Evidence disappears. Witnesses vanish. Perfect certainty becomes impossible. But certainty was never the only goal. Truth was. And truth had finally resurfaced. Michael walked through the old evidence room one final time. The shelves stretched endlessly. Thousands of boxes. Thousands of names. Thousands of unfinished stories. He stopped beside the original file. One thin folder. One life interrupted forever. He touched the cover gently. Then closed it. After 37 years.
Closed.
Outside, snow began falling once again. Softly. Quietly. Almost identical to the night everything began. The city glowed beneath its lights. Cars moved through wet streets. People hurried home. Life continued. It always does. But somewhere inside New York, something had changed forever. A ghost had finally been identified. A secret had finally been cornered. A lie had finally run out of time. And perhaps that is the most terrifying lesson hidden inside every cold case. Not that monsters exist, but that monsters can live beside us unnoticed. For years. For decades. They can smile, wave to neighbors, buy groceries, read newspapers, grow old, and carry their secrets through entire lifetimes. Until one tiny detail destroys everything. One forgotten sentence. One old notebook. One detective who trusted an instinct. That was all it took. Not an army. Not a miracle. Just persistence. Because truth is stubborn. Truth waits. Truth survives. And no matter how deeply it is buried, truth has a habit of breathing again. As night settled over New York, Michael Donovan walked out of headquarters for the last time. He paused at the steps, looked at the falling snow, then disappeared into the crowd. No cameras followed him. No speeches were given. No dramatic ending arrived. Only silence. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of mystery. Not the silence of failure. The silence of something finally finished. Yet even then, one unsettling thought remained. How many other notebooks still sit forgotten inside old boxes? How many other instincts were dismissed? How many other ghosts are waiting patiently beneath decades of dust? Because somewhere tonight in some city, someone may still believe they escaped. Someone may still believe time is their ally. Someone may still believe the world has forgotten. But time never truly forgets. Time only waits. And eventually, for everyone, it comes back.